Violet Trefusis was a famously passionate writerly footnote in the love affair of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, courtesy of the character of Sasha in Woolf's Orlando. But who exactly was the woman behind the portrait? The woman who famously said, "Across my life, only one word will be written: waste. Waste of life, waste of talent, waste of enterprise."
That's intense.
As we will see, nothing about this love affair was not intense. Born in 1894 into the minor British aristocracy, Violet Keppel grew up believing King Edward VII was her father. He was not. But neither was George Keppel, her mother's husband, though Violet's younger sister was certainly a Keppel because of her nose.
So why exactly would she think that the king was her father?
Because her mother was King Edward's mistress. And this had a huge impact on her life. Her childhood consisted of being cared for by servants and traveling around Europe. This is probably part of the reason she didn't befriend people her own age until about 1905, when she was 10 years old.
Yeah, oof. It's too fancy for everyone else.
And it is at 10 where she meets the person who changes her life forever. At a tea party, she encounters Vita Sackville-West. Within a few days, Vita was invited to Violet's house, where they talked for hours about books, adventure, and ancestry. That day ended with Violet kissing her goodbye, and we're off to the races. As Violet later wrote, no one loves more passionately than at the age of 10.
Oof.
She idolized Vita and bombarded her with letters. Vita was not put off by this, being a lonely only child left to her own devices in a giant ancestral home, and with no friends prior to Violet.
Oh, so they only have each other.
Our protagonist, as you suspected, was also lonely, but in a different way. She didn't get along with her sister, saw her mother as a remote authority figure, the king as bewildering, her legal father as a rarely there shadow, and was left surrounded by servants. These two young women would then attend the same school, Helen Woolf's School for Girls. While both were smart, Vita was better at exams. The education itself was very conservative. Free thinking was deeply discouraged.
Oh, sounds intense.
That is not to say they were confined, though. Both took Italian and dance lessons, visited Violet's legal father at his office, and then went to the theater. There were even separate trips to France. This constant interaction did produce some intellectual benefits. It spurred Violet into actually learning French because Vita was fluent.
Oh.
Pour one out for all the time we've gone to language lessons entirely because of a crush on a girl.
Mm-hmm. Single tear. I cry every time.
At 13, Violet told Vita that she loved her. Vita felt the same, but stumbled over her words, and honestly saying it was probably surprising. This declaration was followed by a chaperoned trip to Italy to improve their Italian, where, when Vita left early, Violet cried and gave her a Doge's lava ring as a present.
Oh, it's beautiful.
They eventually saw each other again some months later, when they stayed up all night talking. For Violet, it was already a very intense relationship, as she wrote, "How I loved you then. I was afraid of your guessing how much I loved you. The lanky, awkward, adorable you that wrote historical novels and had no sense of humor. Darling, how dreadfully happy we were before we grew up, you and I. I am terribly against being grown up. It does nobody any good."
Oof. So, that bespeaks some problems in the future then.
Yes, naturally, here we have the foreshadowing of the most famous incident in Violet's life. But first, King Edward VII died in 1910, and Mrs. Keppel whisked her family abroad for a time due to propriety. After all, we can't have the dead king's mistress hanging about. Much better to have her in Ceylon, in the Indian Ocean.
Which we can say is modern day Sri Lanka. Far away, where the scandal can't follow.
Violet didn't enjoy the trip. She hated the heat and the spicy food, and came to the conclusion that she only liked a hint of the Oriental, places like southern Spain that used to be under Eastern rule centuries ago.
I love the implication that the Oriental encompasses Sri Lanka and also Muslim rule of Spain. Like, oh yes, those are exactly the same thing. The Oriental. Whatever. Rich white girls.
I was going to say British imperial thought process of the time.
Yeah.
Another thing she hated was that she was losing Vita, who had a lover in Rosamund Grosvenor and had met Harold Nicholson, her future husband.
Oof. Vita's drifting apart.
The trips to ancient ruins, picnics, and later hunting parties in the jungle didn't distract her from thoughts of Vita. Finally, her mother left for China and sent a 17-year-old Violet, her sister, and their governess to Munich. The two were then enrolled in an international school. While she invited Vita to visit, she never did. The next year, her mother moved them all back to England and threw them into the social scene. Still, Violet was not happy. By her own admission, the only thing in England she cared about was Vita, who is now unofficially engaged to Harold.
So what's up with Vita? Like, why is she? Do we know her perspective on this? Like, oh well, Violet's just gone now, so I guess I'm moving on, or what?
You're hitting on the problem I had doing the research for this episode, in that Vita very much almost unconsciously tries to take over the story of Violet here that we're telling. So I don't want to dive into too much detail because next episode is Vita Sackville-West's episode.
Gotcha. So this will be a one-sided story in which Vita mysteriously disappears.
I will say that when it came to how Vita viewed affairs or anyone who wasn't Harold, she could be very callous.
And it seems from this like she was more polyamorous than Violet was.
Oh, yes, Violet was not really polyamorous, as we will see.
Mm-hmm. Vita seems more into kind of being with multiple people at different times and letting those affairs kind of drift in and out of her life.
Back to the story of Violet's return to England. Depending on how you see it, the social whirl was not a success. She scared men who found her too acerbic and too clever.
This woman I'm talking to is too clever. Like, what?
She scares me and my weaker intellect.
No, help! This woman isn't submitting to me.
Vita, meanwhile, was abroad during Violet's coming out party, and that wasn't ideal either, from Violet's point of view anyway. Despite the fact that Violet liked dancing, was a good mimic, and could hold sparkling conversation when she felt like it, she also chafed at all the rules and scorned the society she now found herself in. Her reaction to Vita's affairs was to flirt with men to make Vita jealous, which worked to an extent, but Vita didn't break off her other relationships, and our protagonist remained jealous herself.
And flirting with people she didn't like. That's like the worst outcome.
This behavior extended as far as Violet getting engaged and then breaking the engagement off. And when Vita married in 1913, Violet didn't attend the wedding.
Yeah, no, because she is still hung up on her.
And to put an end to this easy aristocratic whirl of everyone's lives and the endless pursuit of Vita, World War I crashed the party.
Yeah, just putting everything in perspective.
All the men Violet insincerely flirted with and briefly got engaged to died in droves. Her legal father also joined as a major and was sent to France, where he spent his 50th birthday in the trenches. He would eventually be posted to Ireland in 1916 to train soldiers instead of fight.
And what was Violet's contribution to the war effort?
She volunteered to serve food in a canteen in Grosvenor Gardens until she was fired for confusing cleaning powder with hot chocolate mix.
How do you make that mistake?
When one has been raised by servants and has not really cooked or done anything but grab a snack from a kitchen,
Presumably like she's literate, but okay. I guess this was before, like, the labels were as standardized, maybe?
Maybe they were in very similar looking boxes.
I don't know. Regardless, good thing that she was fired from that job.
Her younger sister, on the other hand, had a better time doing the same job at a different location.
Presumably, she could read.
On the chasing after Vita front,
Still
Violet
with
did.
this woman?
Yes,
Get over her.
I told you, Vita unintentionally tries to dominate Violet's story.
Yeah. No, so how did that go?
Violet still doesn't have much success. She saw little of the other woman, who by now had two sons, the eldest of which was Violet's godson at her own sarcastic request.
That is so sad. I don't think anyone should ever have a sarcastic godson. Like, just the level of heartbreak in that, you know?
Violet by now is essentially rudderless. She tries drawing lessons, abandons them, and at one point gets engaged to Osbert Sitwell, a gay English writer who managed not to die in France. While his sister Edith believed the marriage would work, Osbert later complained about the way Violet treated him, namely that she still flirted with other men at parties.
Okay, why does he care? Or is it like an optics thing? Like, it makes him look bad.
I suspect it's an optics thing, and as we speak of Violet Trefusis and not Violet Sitwell, it can be assumed this engagement ended quickly.
Yeah, it sounds like they didn't work out well.
On other fronts, not even another woman inviting her around and saying she loved her could make Violet shake Vita out of her head.
Ooh, who's this other woman?
The other woman in question was Pat Dancy, another daughter of an English aristocrat who actually lived in a castle, showed Violet a dungeon where Edward II was murdered, and would give Violet photographs of herself.
Oh my god. Violet, just get over Vita and date this other woman. She sounds really cool.
I mean, maybe if Violet could also have then been content with sharing Pat with the daughter of a duke, Joan Campbell.
So there's still a polyamory thing involved.
There is, and as we will see later, Pat comes up again.
Oh, foreshadowing.
And now this stalemate changes when Vita's husband caught some STD and admitted to her that he had been sleeping with men throughout their marriage. But, he assured her, she was the only one he loved.
God, dude. That I mean we don't have the exact quote in this text, but any way you slice it, that's not a great thing to say. Okay, the thing is, we already know that Vita is like polyamorously inclined. She's had multiple relationships at once. She's like chill with that. Surely if her husband talked to her about being into men, and also we know that she's into women, if her husband talked to her about being into men and about liking being more polyamorous, like, she would have probably been okay with that. I feel like, right? So this whole situation would have been chill if they had just been communicating.
Well, they were not communicating on this prior to this incident. Going forward, they would, but as we will see, it does not automatically mean everything was chill. In fact, as you'll see in Vita's episode, I would go so far as to say anything involving Vita is decidedly not chill.
Oof. Was she like being homophobic at him? Because that I have heard of that happening where people who are like same sex attracted and also have a partner of the other gender who is will like be weird, like they're like, oh, it's okay for me to be a gay man, but you can't be a lesbian or whatever, that sort of thing.
No.
Okay, there's other stuff going on. Well, we'll see. We'll see. I'm not gonna make this about Vita.
Yes, thank you for that, because Violet already makes this so much about Vita. And so the next time Violet stays over on a visit to see Vita, an affair starts between them. Violet was 24, Vita 26, and though Vita liked to cast Violet in the role of seductress, our protagonist was actually quite inexperienced.
Yeah, I mean she's been turning other people down because she likes Vita so much.
Meanwhile, Vita has had no qualms running off with other women. Anyway, it has taken us 14 years, but Violet finally has her woman. Or does she?
Or does she?
Harold is still around. In fact, he arranges their travel plans and lodging on the spontaneous Cornwall holiday that follows. While Violet ditched every flirtation immediately, Vita did not fling Harold overboard, though he was off at work constantly and rarely even at their house for months at a time.
Now, does I'm assuming that he knows what's going on there.
He is aware.
Do we know how he feels about this?
He does not like Violet in the slightest.
Gotcha.
And so now things settle into a lopsided love triangle of Violet wants Vita, Vita wants Violet, Harold wants Vita. Vita doesn't want to give up or hurt Harold. Harold is incredibly jealous of the entire situation and exasperated at Violet's existence.
Yeah, so it sounds like a great living situation.
A more straight from the horse's mouth description of how Harold viewed Violet, especially as things progressed. He called her evil, torturous, erotic, irresponsible, a fierce orchid glimmering and stinking in the recesses of life. He wished she was dead, said she had poisoned one of the most sunny things that ever happened.
Damn. Also, though, she knew Vita first, so, like, had poisoned one of the most sunny things. Like, they already knew each other. It wasn't like she suddenly met her and now Vita's ruined or whatever. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know.
I can say that Violet very much wanted Vita to leave Harold and run away with her, even overseas to France. So we have all this going on, the lopsided love triangle. There's also gossip about all this and the fact that Violet's mother encourages Violet to write to a Major Denis Trefusis, who was away fighting in France.
Oh, that last name is familiar.
Indeed, it is. All this does not stop Violet from writing to Vita about running away together and living openly.
That sounds a bit risky.
Well, Violet is very much a dreamer, and she's quite rebellious, as we have seen. Instead of running away, they were soon collaborating on a novel, Challenge, which was a fictional account about their affair with a sex change for Vita in order to get it published. It was not published back then. Vita's mother would see to that. By then, the two were also using a variation of Romani language when writing to each other and invented nicknames. Vita was Mitya and Violet was Lushka. So even if the novel was throttled, no one succeeded in stopping this train wreck at the same time. Violet was still chafing at social convention at this time, writing, I hate lies. I am so fed up with lies. Not surprisingly, considering she also wrote things like, be wicked, be brave, be drunk, be reckless, be dissolute, be despotic, be an anarchist, be a religious fanatic, be a suffragette, be anything you like, but for pity's sake, be it to the top of your bent. Live. Live fully, live passionately, live disastrously if necessary. Live the gamut of human experiences, build, destroy, build up again. Live, let's live you and I, let's live as none ever lived before. Let's explore and investigate, let's tread fearlessly where even the most intrepid have faltered and held back.
I really like Violet's writing there. I think it is really like intense and fun. And I feel like it falls into this trope of like the lesbian versus the bisexual who fall in love. You see this fictionally a lot too, where the lesbian like has no other option but to love women. And so she's kind of like, well, I'm going to go all in. I'm going to love a woman. We're going to be, together. And, maybe we'll even be open about it or we'll have some sort of pseudo marriage thing going on. And the bisexual woman who has options is like, no, I'm good. I'll just flirt with men, flirt with women, see where I go with it, you know. I feel like more of it though is a product of a homophobic time. Like as we reach more equality, you get less of people having to live like that in either case. And also people who are polyamorous can just say it and then, you know, people don't have to have their feelings hurt.
That being said, Violet was not exactly living at the time. Her mother insisted on inviting Denis Trefusis around when he was on leave from the front. Vita liked him, compared him to an acolyte searching for the Holy Grail. Much like them, he would not find his end goal, which was probably happiness, partly because Violet was gay, and partly because Vita was sexually possessive and wanted Violet all to herself.
Yeah, so that's not gonna work. Also, can I just say the Holy Grail as symbol of femininity and specifically like there's a lot of virginity and chastity involved in the mythology around it. Great image for a guy chasing after a lesbian.
I wonder if Vita knew what she was doing when she made that comparison.
Yeah.
As for Violet, the only reason she went along with this duplicity was to appease her mother and to provoke Vita into leaving Harold via threat of losing her.
Oh, Violet, you know this is not gonna work.
If Violet knew it wasn't going to work, she wouldn't have done it.
but I'm looking at previous patterns. But anyway, we'll see what happens.
Say what you want about the woman, but she's very passionate, dedicated, and firmly has her blinders on.
Mm-hmm.
The war now drew to a close. Violet has a problem with this, because now Denny's Trefusis is coming home and expecting to marry her, and all the world is expecting her to go through with this farce.
That just sounds very, to a lesbian especially, claustrophobic.
Confronted with this fate, she, along with Vita, gathered up permits and visas and fled to Paris right as the war ended. This was not as filled with subterfuge as you imagine. Vita asked Harold to help smooth the way to get there, as he was a diplomat, and he agreed.
And he agreed.
On the other hand, Violet's mother agreed because Dennis would be in Paris, and the two would briefly see and lunch with him. Then they went south without telling anyone to Monte Carlo and Greece. No, they did not visit the island of Lesbos as far as anyone knows.
Ugh, tragic.
They decided to live like the characters they created in the joint novel, initially called Rebellion and later called Challenge. At one point, they left a hotel in a flurry after causing outrage by dancing together in public.
Not that.
At points, Vita dressed as a man, what she called her Julian clothes, named for the character version of herself in the novel. People by then were vexed at not knowing where they were. Harold wrote to a mutual friend in a fuss, saying he put the whole mess down to that swine Violet who seems to addle your brain. Still, the two women spent Christmas at Monaco, where they lost 350 francs at the casino, and Violet gave Vita corals for a present. As pressures mounted and as neither actually had her own money, Violet only had an allowance from her mother, and Vita's finances were tied with Harold's. The two returned to England in March.
Yeah, isn't that awful that both of them have to rely financially on people who do not want them to be together?
More so in Violet's case because she's not earning any money. You do have to remember Vita has become a published writer by this point, but because she is married and laws and conventions of the time, her finances are tied with Harold's, despite her
Right.
earning her own money.
The man of the house.
A week later, Mrs. Keppel took Violet to a society ball and announced her surprise engagement to Denny Trefusis, despite Violet repeatedly telling him no during the 2 or 3 times he proposed.
Dang, what is wrong with her mom?
She is doing what she sees is her duty with a very flighty, not at all right in the head daughter, meaning securing her future.
I mean, it's securing a future, but
Well, think of it this way from the point of view of a Victorian woman who was the mistress of a king. It's all well and good to have affairs, but you must present the society picture front. So you must get married.
I guess that makes sense. It seems like this is the wrong way of going. Like the whole going to Greece and whatever seems to have come directly out of her mother pressuring her so much, you know?
Yes, Violet is more modern than her mother. From her mother's point of view, marriage and love are two very different things. For Violet, a lifelong commitment and love go together.
Yeah. Oh.
By now, the love affair was turning into a quagmire, and Violet didn't know what to do. She wrote, Mitya, I can't face this existence. I'm losing every atom of self respect I ever possessed. With the possibility of a diplomatic solution of using Denny's as a decoy and continuing on with Vita in secret, an arrangement that didn't suit Violet, who I really feel would have been much better off in our own time 100 years later, Violet was essentially then frog marched to the altar on June 16th, 1919. Vita did not burst in and rescue her, as was speculated, and as she herself acknowledges, she might when writing Harold, where she called the idea great fun. No, instead, Violet wrote, You have broken my heart. Goodbye.
Oh.
As you might have guessed already, this was not actually goodbye.
No, these two women are just continually caught up in each other.
And so the mess continued. The newlyweds went to France for their month-long honeymoon. Harold was working there on the Paris Peace Conference, and Vita was with him. So naturally, she stole Violet away for a time. By the end of that month, both Violet and Denny's wanted a divorce.
Oh,
They
man, so he's realized that she hasn't been into him this whole time after she refused his proposals a couple of times.
Yes, when it comes to the whole proposal story, I picture a more dapper version of the cousin from Pride and Prejudice who proposes
Mhm.
to Lizzie Bennet and is refused and just doesn't take no for an answer.
Just like, "Oh, your modesty must prevent it." Oh, well, I love a modest woman.
This is not actually the case in either of those events, but in the case of the divorce between Violet and Denny's, they were thwarted when they returned to England. Mrs. Keppel was concerned about what a divorce would do to Violet's little sister's marriage prospects, right when the younger woman wanted to get married. Dennis now also had tuberculosis and spent even less time with Violet. A few months later, Vita and Violet were off to Paris again. Violet wanted to elope. Vita was unsure and persuaded her to postpone any elopement till February 1920, but she also wrote to Harold that she loved him deeply.
No.
February saw the planned elopement very quickly derail like a runaway train. Vita's heart wasn't in it. She sent Violet ahead of her across the channel. Then she sent telegrams to Harold and everyone else she could think of to save her from this decision.
Oh my god, just communicate. Just, like, talk to Violet and be like, "Hey, I'm actually not really feeling this."
Well, that didn't happen, and this is how Dennis found her, and the two traveled across to France, while he confided that he intended to leave Violet once they got there.
That's gonna be an interesting journey.
Apparently, the two got on quite well.
Wild.
From Calais, Vita and Violet traveled inland, and Dennis left for England again. During this whole time, Vita continued to wire people, which is how George Keppel, Violet's legal father, found them and then demanded Denny's come at once. Tired of trains, Dennis decided to take a plane, and Harold went with him.
Ooh, another fun journey. I wonder what they had to talk about.
I suspect they got along less well than Vita and Dennis did. Then followed a very heated confrontation with suspicions that Violet slept with Denny's, which provided a convenient excuse for Vita to leave. Vita seized said excuse, caused a scene screaming in the hotel, rushed upstairs to pack, and left with Harold.
How dare you sleep with your husband? I'm gonna go sleep with my husband.
This despite both Violet and Denny's saying that they had never had anything of the kind between them. As Vita fled back to England, Harold, and her children, Violet was left alone with Dennis in a now obvious sham of a marriage, and barred by her mother from returning to England in order to preserve her sister's chance at marriage.
So what are they gonna do now?
They went south and alternated between silence and arguments while having separate hotel rooms. When they asked again for an annulment, Mrs. Keppel told Dennis she would not support or see Violet if it happened, essentially leaving Violet destitute and homeless if Denny's wouldn't remain married to and taking care of her. So they remained married. Violet, in the meantime, barraged Vita with letters, which were only sometimes read.
Oof.
After 6 weeks, Vita met her again in France. They quarreled more, and by the end, Vita returned to England in her socially acceptable life and left Violet adrift.
Classic bisexual.
I hate this trope.
But it did happen.
In this story, yes, it did happen. And now, not even Violet's mother will see her. She and Denny's struggled to appear in a conventional marriage. He, at one point, burned Vita's letters to her as a result. Eventually, the love affair died torturously. Violet was then forbidden from writing to Vita, though at times she wrote to her via mutual friend Pat Dancy, who was also having an affair with Vita.
Love it. So it's really one of those, sapphic cases of the ex of my ex is my ex.
Life post Vita was miserable. For a time, she lost weight and was adrift with no allowance from her mother. She was 27 with no plans nor ideas for how to live her life.
I mean, yeah, this partnership has been in her mind since she was 10. Like, she has been obsessed with this person for such a huge chunk of her life.
Over half her life now, 17 years out of 27.
Yeah. So, yeah, understandably, she's adrift.
During this time, she tries briefly to write a novel, but that doesn't work out. She then moved with Denis to Paris. Eventually, she began to write in earnest, both in French and in English. She didn't publish the first one, which was a fictionalized version of the end of her affair with Vita.
Yeah, better to keep that under wraps, I'd say.
In 1923, Denis introduced her to Winteretta Singer, the Princess de Polignac, and last episode's subject.
Did he know what he was doing?
I believe he did.
What an ally. What a hashtag ally. I love this for him.
I mean, he also had his mistresses, so they were very
Mhm.
much conforming to the social mores of the time.
Right. Especially in Paris. I mean, them French.
The resulting affair was entirely within the bounds of social convention, meaning kept to the sides and shadows. Singer also helped get Violet's novels published and brought her back into society through her musical salon. Even Mrs. Keppel approved for once.
Your lesbian girlfriend is discreet this time.
Discreet, rich, and titled.
God, Mrs. Keppel is so mercenary.
Slowly, Violet started building a life, though it was not the life she had always wanted. She bought a house in the French countryside and furnished it with the help of Singer's money, and then went on a cruise down the Nile with her. Back in France, she attended lectures at the Sorbonne University and brought out her first novel in French, Emergency Exit. Things had calmed down.
Do we know anything about emergency exit?
It is about a woman who seduces an older man in order to make her lover jealous.
Oh, yeah. I wonder if that reflects her life at all.
Probably. Dennis would die in 1929 of tuberculosis in Paris, but his death didn't free Violet in the way she spent years fighting for during the affair with Vita. While a young widow was more socially acceptable than a divorcee, she wasn't going to have the life she envisioned now. She didn't go back to Vita. She didn't run off with anyone, actually. Instead, she bought a derelict tower in France and wrote novels from there, including her own fictional account of her affair with Vita that was similar to Challenge. And speaking of Challenge, that would eventually come out in the US after the printing was stopped in the UK years before as the affair spiraled. Soon, another book joined the trio, Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Now, the two never met. Virginia only knew Violet through Vita's account of the affair. One can see then how Violet felt wounded by the portrayal, where again, Vita was the hero, and Violet the, at best, morally gray anti hero on the verge of turning into the villain.
Right, the evil lesbian who's trying to trap the poor innocent bisexual.
Violet's own writing continued, though she never achieved prominence. Her life up until World War II was filled with friends, phone calls, visiting her mother in Italy, and insomnia. During the 1930s, her affair with Singer ended, partly because Violet still wasn't at ease with the polite society way of doing things and hiding who you were dating. That being said, she did flaunt her quasi seductions, as one biographer called them, the gay, usually rich, entitled men whom mock courted her after Dennis died.
I love this. I love that she doesn't really like, sleeping around or whatever. She's not that sort of lady, but she loves flirting with everyone.
Yes, well, perhaps they were to hide her affairs with women like the Duchess d'Harcourt and the Princess Gilonne de Chimay. Perhaps they were part fun and part terror induced by her mother's constant sounding of having a husband to hide everything behind. Who knows, really?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the whole marriage to the Trefusis guy really would have been traumatic for her. That now she has to present to her mother, "Oh yeah, I'm being very heterosexual in public," because otherwise her mother's gonna frog march her into that again, take away all of her autonomy.
Either way, she did have fun. For her 43rd birthday, she rented the Eiffel Tower for a costume ball in 1937.
It sounds like a blast, honestly. Like, can you imagine what that must have looked like?
Well, we can imagine what everyone was wearing, because they had to dress as if it was 1889 when the tower was completed.
1937 does 1889. The fabrics, the colors.
World War II cut into this life 2 years later.
Of course it did.
Violet Dean went to leave France. For a time, she stayed with her lover Antoinette d'Harcourt, who would join the French resistance. At her instigation, Violet briefly joined the ambulance brigade, even though she couldn't drive.
God, so it's just like the Coco incident. She does not know what to do with herself. She's too rich for her own good.
Health troubles followed, unexplained back pain, and then her teeth were loose in her gums. By mid 1940, though, she had bigger problems. France was lost. With the invasion and occupation of France, Violet was forced back to England for the first time in over a decade. She stayed with several friends and tentatively contacted Vita.
Ooh. How'd that go over?
There was great back and forth and cancellations on actually meeting face to face after decades. They finally sat down to lunch on December 15th, 1940. Violet was 46 and Vita was 48. Things did not ignite again. Vita recognized it as belonging in the past and perhaps felt guilty for how she portrayed the woman who had only loved her with single-hearted obstinacy in the face of every obstacle. Violet also acknowledged that the affair was long dead, but she did want a friendship. Vita was, after all, the first friend she had ever made, all the way back when she was 10 years old, and being shunted about in the shadow of her mother's affair with the Prince of Wales. While they remained in contact, it seems to have been a fragile as glass, not quite friendship between them.
Yeah, I could see where there would be a bit of tension given how they left it.
The rest of the war saw Violet writing news articles and eventually earning the Legion of Honor for her work doing broadcasting to the Free French. But she lost confidence in herself as a writer and felt no one gave a damn.
Oof.
The end of the war saw Violet running back to France as quickly as possible. There she continued her life as she had led it before the war, writing and socializing. By now, her mother was actually proud of her because Violet acted more like her. Personally, I would not call that a compliment. Said mother would die in 1947, and George Keppel would die the same year. One could say she was finally free to do as she pleased, but it had come far too late. By the 50s, Violet herself was frail in body and mind. She had osteoporosis and broke several bones. Her life was chaotic. She constantly forgot to tell servants things like how many people would be there for dinner, and she used too much makeup to hide her distress at her life. She withdrew into her own world just as she had once written Vita that she felt herself prone to doing if it wasn't for her. Vita would die in 1962. Violet's own health declined in 1963. She broke her hip again that summer. At 70, she looked 80. Insomnia and pain plagued her. A single glass of champagne could knock the wits out of her. She died in 1972, at the age of 77, of a malabsorption disease at the Italian villa she'd inherited from her mother. Her funeral included the Florentine aristocracy from the nearby city and the Queen of Romania.
Wow,
Her
did she know the Queen of Romania?
Yes, she did.
And you didn't say it anywhere?
It's not really mentioned, so I'm assuming it's not really like a friendship exactly, or not a close one.
So it's one of those cases where like she kind of felt abandoned in her old age, but then like everyone crawled out of the woodwork after she died to be like, "Hey, I knew her."
I think it's more a consequence of leading the social life that her mother had led and had always envisioned that Violet would lead.
That she knows all these prominent people in a very like sparkling wit kind of social interaction way and not in a like deep friendship way.
Correct. Her ashes were then split between her mother's grave and the base of her old French tower home. Her epitaph read simply, "She withdrew." And as I mentioned before, when I started this tale, I didn't want her life to revolve around Vita. I figured there'd be more to it, you know? but it seems Violet herself had other plans. Could you love someone so much that they literally consume the story of your life? It's a sad tale, because to this day, she's still just a footnote.
Now, I do have a question before we end here. I've been noticing your citations say Keppel. Any relation?
When I write my citations, Pixie,
Hmm.
they don't necessarily include the author's name.
Oh, okay, it's like the
So,
title of the
the
book or something?
yes, the citations you're seeing actually are from the title of the book, which is Mrs. Keppel and Her Daughter.
Wow! So she's a footnote in her mother's book, too.
Well, actually, despite the title of that book, the book is primarily about Violet.
Oh, so they're trying to say that she's kind of living in the shadow of her mother, who is being so controlling.
Yeah, which she kinda does, as we saw.
Yeah, no, she can make so few decisions about her life without her mother like clamping down on her. It's really sad. So what did we learn from this? Do you have any bits of wisdom? Don't be an overbearing lesbian or a flighty bisexual.
Well, first, thank you for listening. Subscribe wherever you're listening, if possible. And as Violet herself said, live fully, live passionately, live disastrously, be to the top of your bent.
And don't get hung up on your childhood crush, is what she didn't say.